Good evening. Welcome to UT Southwestern Science Café. For our regulars, welcome back. And for our new guests, we're so pleased that you've joined us this evening. My name is Joya Lang, and I am part of the Public Affairs team at UT Southwestern. On behalf of my colleagues, Charlie Thompson and Jenny King, as well as our guest speaker, Dr. Rana Gupta, thank you for joining us tonight. Science Cafés are online conversations where our speakers take you on deep dives into science topics. We have fun while we learn. Our format is casual and interactive, and we encourage you to ask questions and engage with us during the program. This evening, we will be discussing diabetes, obesity, and genetics with Dr. Rana Gupta. More on him in just one moment. Before we begin, I'd like to mention a few technical matters. We are recording tonight's program and live streaming it to our UT Southwestern Twitter page. Please mute your microphones to help everyone's audio clarity and unmute yourself if you're called on to ask a question. We encourage you to utilize the chat feature to list questions for Dr. Gupta. We will start Q&A at the conclusion of his presentation. Charlie will facilitate Q&A, and we will monitor your questions in the chat box. Finally, just a reminder, while we cannot answer personal medical questions, we would love to hear from you with general questions. And with that, I am pleased to introduce our guest speaker. Dr. Rana Gupta is an associate professor of internal medicine and is a researcher in the UT Southwestern Touchstone Diabetes Center. He is also a lead investigator in the Gupta laboratory. The Gupta lab focuses on the molecular and developmental mechanisms controlling adipose tissue development and expansion in obesity. Dr. Gupta teaches and advises graduate students in the genetics, development, and disease programs. He received his undergraduate degree and PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. We will put his bio in the chat. Dr. Gupta, thank you for joining us this evening. Welcome to Science Café. The virtual podium is yours.
All right. Thanks so much, Joy. I appreciate it. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I thank you and Jenny and Charlie for organizing this meeting today and for the opportunity to talk to you guys about something that's very important to me and others here at Southwestern, and that is sort of metabolism research as it pertains to obesity and diabetes. Just a little bit about me and my research team. My laboratory is part of a larger group called the Touchstone Diabetes Center. And our diabetes center is headed by Dr. Philip Scherer. You can kind of see him here on the far right, standing behind his colleague. And we are a group of basic scientists. Most of us are not clinicians. We are basic scientists. So we're not the people who see patients with diabetes, but we are actually basic scientists who are trying to understand the molecular basis of diabetes, the disease, and try to come up with therapeutic strategies to help treat diabetes and associated diseases. Now, I'm proud to say that we are a very diverse group of individuals that come from all parts of the world and all walks of life, but we share a common interest, and that is understanding those molecular mechanisms that connect obesity to diabetes through the biology of fat cells. And my hope is that by the time we're done having our discussion today, that you guys can appreciate what we appreciate about fat cells and why these cells that would seemingly be maybe vilified by others or seem to be boring are actually living a secret life that we find to be fascinating. So I want to begin with asking you guys a question. And Joya, could you load the first poll question? So my question to you guys is, what percentage of adults, of all adults in Texas, do you think are impacted by obesity? And your choices there are on the screen. Okay, so a majority of you say greater than 40%. I think you're pretty close, and that answer will be true really soon. So let me show you guys here. If you look at this heat map here, which indicates the prevalence of obesity amongst all adults across the country, the more red you see, the higher percentage of individuals have obesity. And indeed, of about 35% of Texans, adults in Texas, are considered obese. So what is considered obese? One is considered to have obesity if their BMI is greater than 30, and their BMI represents their body mass index, which is it's calculated by dividing your weight in kilograms by the square of your height in meters. Now, in Texas and about 15 other states, at least 1/3 of all adults are impacted by obesity. And it's predicted that by 2030, in those same 15 or 16 states, more than half of the adults in those states will be impacted by obesity. And one thing to know, and it's not depicted here on this graph, is that there's a tremendous racial disparity in these numbers and in the incidence of obesity. If you consider just adults that are non-Hispanic and Black American, this whole map is pretty much red, dark red. And also obesity, the rates of obesity are rising tremendously amongst our children and adolescents. I think the current numbers or current estimates that the incidence of obesity amongst children is about 17 or 18%. But now with the pandemic and the number of kids that have been sedentary over the last, almost 2 years now, those numbers are about to go up tremendously. So why is this concerning? Well, as most of you can appreciate, obesity is a significant risk factor for multiple chronic diseases. Now, we often think about it a lot in terms of its connection to diabetes, but it's important to realize that obesity is a significant risk factor for developing really a large number of chronic diseases that afflict our society, including heart disease, cancer, neurodegeneration, and a number of related musculoskeletal disorders. Importantly, and very apropos to what's happening today, obesity increases the risk of severe complications from COVID-19. And in fact, those individuals with obesity are, I think, 2 or 3 times at greater risk of hospitalization from infection with COVID-19. But this is a real problem that affects our whole healthcare system across the board. But as it relates to type 2 diabetes, it's actually remarkable. There's about 34 million individuals in this country today, in the United States, that are diagnosed with diabetes. This represents about 10% of our US population. And even way more are considered to be in this pre-diabetic state. So what is diabetes? Well, just as a refresher to those who don't know, diabetes is a disorder in which we have too much glucose in our bloodstream. Now, why is this a problem? Well, glucose needs to be in our cells. Glucose is a fuel to help drive our cells and the basic function of our cells. But also, when glucose accumulates in the bloodstream, this can be toxic to our blood vessels and a number of tissues. So this is a serious problem to have diabetes. Now, what drives glucose to enter our cells is a hormone called insulin. Insulin is a hormone that's produced by the pancreas, and its levels increase in the blood after a meal when glucose levels rise. Now, you can consider insulin to be sort of a key that unlocks the door for glucose to enter cells. Now, type 1 diabetes is characterized by what we call insulin deficiency. That's when we don't have any insulin or enough insulin produced by the pancreas to open the door and allow glucose to enter the cells. But we also have type 2 diabetes, which is different. Type 2 diabetes is characterized by a state of what we call insulin resistance. That's when we have insulin on board. We have a lot of insulin on board, but there's something wrong with the lock that opens this door. In other words, insulin can't work. And therefore, we need a lot more insulin to overcome this challenge to get glucose to come into the cells. Now, let me ask you guys another question, which is pretty important. What do you guys think is really the cost of treating insulin in this country? So, Joya, if you can load the next poll question. Absolutely right. A majority of you said 327 billion, and that is exactly right. $327 billion are estimated to be spent on treating individuals with diabetes and all the associated problems. Now, just to put this into perspective, this represents about 1/7 of all healthcare dollars that are spent in this country annually, which is an enormous burden on our healthcare system. And it's also an enormous burden at the individual level. Those with diabetes are estimated pay 2 to 3 times greater in their individual healthcare costs than other individuals. So this is really a problem not only on a macro scale, but at an individual scale. But this is where it gets interesting. Not all individuals with obesity actually develop insulin resistance and diabetes. Now, this implies that it's not your BMI per se that dictates whether you will develop diabetes and metabolic disease. There's something else that's happening associated with obesity that is leading to metabolic disease. And in fact, there's a number of individuals that are obese, but maintain a relative degree of metabolic health. Now, this is not to say that they are as metabolically healthy as a lean individual, but they're relatively more healthy than other obese individuals. And we call this state of sort of metabolically healthy obesity. Now, this is kind of a controversial term because it's not clear if the state of metabolic health endures for a long period of time or whether it's transient, but there's certainly individuals who maintain metabolic health for a period of time. And then the key question becomes, well, why? Why are some individuals protected, at least for a period of time, from developing insulin resistance? And importantly, if we can understand this, can we separate then obesity from diabetes and break the link between obesity and diabetes? So to answer this question, we need to take a step back. And in thinking about obesity, we need to think about it in the context of energy balance. Now, in thinking about energy balance and how we maintain energy balance in mammals, we're guided by this first law of thermodynamics, which you probably learned about in high school and maybe college, where it states that energy cannot be created or destroyed. And what that means in practical terms is that all of the net caloric intake that we take in from our feeding, the net caloric intake, that is all the calories that we extract from food after digesting that food, that energy has to be either utilized through our basal metabolism or physical activity. And then what's not utilized has to go somewhere, so we store it. Now, throughout evolution, organisms have been able to store excess energy in the form of triglyceride, which is depicted here in the bottom left. And each species has developed different ways of storing triglyceride. In worms, they store excess energy actually in intestinal cells. So the intestinal cells is where you store excess triglyceride. In fruit flies, they have something called the fat body, which is actually kind of like the liver and your fat tissue combined, where they store excess energy in the form of triglyceride. But in higher vertebrates, in mammals, we have all evolved a specialized compartment to store extra energy in the form of triglyceride. It's just a specialized compartment that kind of serves as an energy bank, which we call adipose tissue. And adipose tissue is just a technical term for fat tissue. So what I'm showing here is actually a pretty image here that is captured by electron microscopy, scanning electron microscopy, where you can see this sort of lobular structure of fat cells. So right here is a round fat cell, and you have lots of different fat cells here that are engulfed and encapsulated by this sort of collagen matrix, this interstitial tissue and collagen matrix that embeds, in which the fat cells are embedded. Now, we typically image fat tissue by embedding the tissue in a wax and then making these very thin sections. So what you can see here on the left is a thin section visualized under a microscope of adipose tissue. And what you're looking at are these round circles here. Those are your fat cells. And these are characterized by the presence of these large single lipid droplets. We call this a unilocular fat droplet appearance. Now, importantly, these fat cells have the sort of enzymatic machinery to store excess energy in the form of triglyceride when you're in a state of overnutrition, but then importantly, break down that triglyceride and release that energy back into the bloodstream in times of starvation when you need energy. So you can think of it as sort of an energy bank. You can deposit when you want to deposit, and you can withdraw when you need to withdraw. And this view of fat cells as being an energy bank has really been the classical view of fat cells for nearly a century. But then something happened around 1995 or the mid 1990s. That's when we realized as a field that fat cells are living a secret life. And what scientists figured out back in the mid 90s is that fat cells are not just storing excess energy and serving as a bank. They're actually talking. And I say that figuratively, they're talking to the rest of the body through the production of hormones and various peptides and proteins that collectively we call adipokines. Adipokines referring to adipocyte-derived molecules. So adipocyte is just a technical term for the word fat cell. Now, what's remarkable is that this realized then that these fat cells are secreting factors into the bloodstream, making them an endocrine organ, just like any other endocrine organ. And most famously, one of the first ones to be identified is a protein called leptin. Now, leptin is a hormone that's secreted by fat cells and actually talks to the brain. And it tells the brain, stop eating. And this is remarkable. That means the fat cells are actually controlling appetite. This is a signal that's raised as one becomes obese that then tells the brain, hey, I'm good. We have enough energy to store. Please stop eating. This kind of revolutionized our view of fat cells as not just sort of regulators of energy storage, but also regulators of food intake, and that are playing a role in various aspects of controlling energy balance. Now, since then, and around the same time, I should say, another very famous and equally important hormone was discovered called adiponectin. And that was actually discovered by my colleague, Philip Scherer, who's now here at the Touchstone Diabetes Center and the division head at the Touchstone Diabetes Center. And what the Scherer lab at UT Southwestern has really realized is that adiponectin is really considered one of the good guys. This is a factor that actually comes out of fat cells and has a number of effects on a number of tissues, including the heart, the liver, the kidney, skeletal muscle, where it protects those tissues from metabolic stress. So what's important to realize is that these fat cells are really talking to a number of organs in a number of different ways, not just storing energy. Now, the importance of fat cells is actually best highlighted by the condition of what we call lipodystrophy. Lipodystrophy is the condition in which you simply don't have any fat cells. And there are genetic forms of lipodystrophy in which individuals lack the genes that are required to make fat cells or store triglyceride. And in this condition of what we call lipodystrophy, when you don't have functional adipocytes or adipose tissue, remember I said that the excess energy has to go somewhere, right? The laws of thermodynamics dictate that those excess calories have to go somewhere. So where do they go? They accumulate in other tissues that are not equipped to handle that triglyceride, that burning. That includes the liver, the skeletal muscle, and the pancreas. And when those tissues are actually overloaded with lipids, it damages those tissues. We call that lipotoxicity, and that leads to metabolic dysfunction. And one such metabolic dysfunction is that it breaks the key that allows insulin to drive glucose uptake into those tissues. In other words, not having functional adipose tissue can lead to insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. Now, this is kind of surprising because I told you earlier that the state of obesity leads to type 2 diabetes, but not having any fat cells at all can also lead to type 2 diabetes, highlighting the importance of having some fat cells on board. Now, the condition that we talk about the most related to adipose tissue is not the loss of adipose tissue, but the gain of adipose tissue, right? The state of obesity. Now, obesity is defined by the accumulation of adipose tissue. And at the most fundamental level, obesity is actually a consequence or a disorder of energy balance. When the net caloric intake exceeds how many calories we're burning, energy expenditure, that creates a demand for energy storage by necessity. So the expansion of adipose tissue that occurs in what we call the setting of positive energy balance is the appropriate adaptation, right? To the demand, increased demand for storing extra calories in the form of triglyceride. Now, for folks like me, if you think about it, this expansion of adipose tissue that we see in the condition of obesity is actually quite remarkable. It's hard to think of any other tissue that has the capacity to expand in size when there's a need to store excess energy, or contract in size when we lose weight. Now, fat cells, white fat cells, can be found throughout the body, but they're invariably found in sort of organized in what we call anatomically distinct depots. Now, you can find fat cells throughout the body, but most of them are classified as either being subcutaneous, which means that they reside just below the skin, or they're considered to be intra-abdominal or visceral, and that is within the intra-abdominal cavity, this so-called sort of belly fat that accumulates. Now, it turns out that in which adipose tissues expand as one develops obesity is actually important. Those individuals who preferentially expand their adipose tissues in the subcutaneous regions, and particularly in the legs and the buttocks, those individuals we actually often see this in females, they're actually at a lower risk for developing diabetes and metabolic syndrome as compared to obese individuals who have the same BMI, but preferentially expand their visceral adipose tissue, their belly fat. And we typically see this in men. Now, what controls this body fat distribution is undoubtedly in part sex hormones. This is impacted by estrogen and testosterone. But what's really interesting is that recent genetic studies are highlighting the importance of genetic variance in determining body fat distribution. What this means is that, simply put, your genes are actually influencing your body fat distribution in addition to your sex hormone, presence of these hormones. Now, what we've come to realize is that these distinct adipose depots located in different parts of the body are not all the same. And what this data is telling us is that each fat depot, each white fat depot in different parts of the body can be actually considered to be a distinct type of organ, if you will. So we don't just have one type of fat cell, we have many types of fat cells that are distinguished by where they are in the body. And what we've come to learn as sort of developmental biologists is that these different types of fat cells come from distinct stem cells and progenitors, distinct developmental origins, and they're under distinct physiological control. And what folks that like me are trying to understand is, where do these different types of fat cells come from? How are they formed? Once they're formed, what regulates their properties, their unique properties? And then practically, can we control their development? Can we influence body fat distribution? So these are the kinds of questions that we're asking. And this is an important question, because if we can control body fat distribution, we may be able to lower the risk for developing metabolic disease. But there's something else that's also important. It's not just important as to where we accumulate adipose tissue, but actually how adipose tissues, how individual tissues actually expand as one develops obesity. Now, if you think about it, any tissue in our body can expand through two mechanisms. One is that we can ask existing cells, one is that we can recruit more cells, right? We can increase the number of cells in that tissue. And in the case of adipose tissue, we can increase the number of fat cells, but fat cells themselves don't replicate. So the number of fat cells is regulated then by, or the increase in number of fat cells is driven by recruitment of stem cells or progenitor cells to become new fat cells. And this is a process we call adipogenesis, or the formation or genesis of new fat cells. So to increase the number of fat cells, we need to actually drive stem cells in the body to actually become new fat cells. But what can also happen is that you can ask existing cells in the body, fat cells in the body, to simply get bigger and bigger and take up more lipid. So there's actually two mechanisms by which the mass of adipose tissue can actually expand. And it turns out that how adipose tissue expands is actually really important. So shown here is a section of adipose tissue from an individual with obesity who is insulin resistant and diabetic. And what you can see here is that there's these large fat cells. We call these large hypertrophic, meaning they're just large fat cells. And in between these fat cells, we see these blue areas, which really indicate inflammation. These are signs of cellular inflammation, immune cells infiltrating these cells. And the idea here is that these cells are probably dying or on their way towards dying. And these cells are overworked. So these fat cells got bigger and bigger, and they seem to be overworked. What we often see in individuals with this kind of adipose tissue is that lipid is spilling over into other tissues. We call this ectopic lipid deposition into the liver and skeletal muscle. And this is really in striking contrast to the adipose tissue that we see in obese individuals with obesity who maintain insulin sensitivity, this sort of metabolically healthy obese state. And if you look at the adipose tissue in these individuals, you see something very different. You see smaller and more numerous fat cells, suggestive of fat tissue expansion by recruiting more fat cells. And you see less of this blue imaging or blue cells in between the fat cells, indicative of less overall cellular inflammation. So what do we make of this? Well, the way we think about this is depicted here in this cartoon. The idea is that as fat cells get bigger and bigger, if you ask them to just accumulate more and more lipid, they become overworked. They reach this tipping point where they just can't handle it anymore. They're overburdened. And what happens then is that the cells start to die, or it starts to trigger a process that leads to tissue inflammation and something we call fibrosis, which is excess collagen deposition, which sort of limits the ability of these tissues to get bigger and bigger. And then what happens then is that you have a lot of fat tissue, but it's not working properly. It becomes dysfunctional. And now lipid is spilling over into these other tissues, similar to what you see in the state of lipodystrophy. So in other words, having a lot of dysfunctional adipose tissue, like we see in the condition of obesity, is very similar to what we see in lipodystrophy when we don't have any adipose tissue, where lipid is spilling over and we have this inadequate adipose tissue storage in a safe place, energy storage in adipose tissue. Now, if you contrast that to what happens in individuals with obesity but maintain insulin sensitivity, the idea here is that by recruiting new fat cells, we're actually calling for backup, right? So it's kind of like saying, hey, we have a lot of energy to store here. I can't handle it. Let's call for backup. We need help. So what's triggering all this then is that stem cells become activated. They become new fat cells. And what this does is limit the burden on any one individual fat cell, thus delaying this progression to adipose tissue dysfunction and the development of insulin resistance and diabetes. So this seems counterintuitive. What I'm telling you here is that actually making fat cells, making new fat cells can actually be a good thing, can actually be a protective thing in the setting of overnutrition. And what this also highlights is that there's a common denominator then between what's happening in obesity versus happening in lipodystrophy. The common denominator is poor energy storage. And that is poor energy storage that's actually fueling and driving the development of insulin resistance and diabetes. So to highlight all this, I want to show you an actual experiment that was done in the laboratory. This was a mouse model that was genetically engineered by my colleagues, Philip Scherer and Christine Kuzminski, two faculty members in the Touchstone Diabetes Center. So what I'm showing you here in this really classic paper now is a mouse on the left. And yes, this is a mouse. This is a mouse with obesity. And mouse was rendered obese by a genetic manipulation that caused their adipose tissue to expand. Now, this mouse is remarkably quite happy despite having obesity. And you can see here on the scale that it weighs about 130 grams. Now, the littermate mouse, the normal mouse with obesity, is about, under the same sort of conditions, it's about half this weight, about 60 grams. But that 60-gram mouse has here, you can see in the middle, glucose levels of about 400 to 500. That's a diabetic mouse. But this mouse I'm showing you on the left, which is weighing twice as much, has glucose levels of about 100. That's a healthy glucose level that you would find in a healthy, lean individual. So what these investigators has done here is actually demonstrated in proof of concept that they can uncouple obesity from diabetes. And if you look at the adipose tissue in these mice, it's quite remarkable. First and foremost, this mouse has preferentially expanded its subcutaneous adipose tissue, not its visceral adipose tissue. And if you look at that subcutaneous adipose tissue, in the diabetic mouse, you can see on the left here, large fat cells. And all that brown stuff you're seeing in between, that's all evidence of inflammation. But now look at, on the right-hand side, this mouse, which is twice as heavy, has smaller and more numerous fat cells. And this is what this really highlights is really proof of concept that obesity does not necessarily have to equal metabolic syndrome, right? It's not obesity per se, but it's about the health, the location and quality of the tissue that's more important. Now, I don't want to give anybody the wrong impression. We're not trying to expand adipose tissue mass necessarily in individuals and make them heavier. But our goal is to understand whether or not we can find ways to promote healthy adipose tissue expansion in the setting of overnutrition. And in other words, can we fix the fat tissue? And that's sort of what we're getting at here. Can we uncouple obesity from metabolic disease by improving the health of adipose tissue? Now, that's one approach. But if you talk to clinicians, particularly here at Southwestern, who have recently have revisited the guidelines for the treatment of diabetes, what they'll tell you is that the most effective way to treat diabetes is to promote healthy weight loss. Now, how do we achieve healthy weight loss? Well, going back to first principles, the way we lose weight is by shifting energy balance such that we're burning more calories than we're taking in. Now, this is much easier said than done. We can reduce our food intake, or we can take measures to increase energy expenditure. So just out of curiosity, I wanted to ask you guys, for those of you that have tried to lose weight, and if you can, Joya, if you can load the next question here, what approaches have you tried? Because there's a lot of things you can try out there. Here's a poll here, and then you can feel free to mark more than one. And I should add that the last choice is not meditation, but medication. Maybe meditation works, reducing stress, whatnot, but it's meant to say medication. Yeah, this is great. Most people have tried a lot of things here, and I can see that. Changing your diet, increasing your exercise, reducing caloric intake altogether. These are all great ideas. These are all effective treatments when done properly and under the direction of your doctor. But let's get real here. This is hard, right? All of us know this is hard. All of us have tried at some point, and there's for some of us it works when done properly. For some of us, it works for only a period of time, and it's hard to sustain. And for others, it might be too difficult for any number of reasons to try some of these measures. So what scientists like myself are also trying to do in parallel, in addition to encouraging healthy lifestyle changes, is to come up with ways in which we can naturally or boost natural systems that promote energy expenditure. And this is one approach. So one more poll question I have for you guys tonight. One more question. How many of you actually heard of brown adipose tissue? Yes or no? Excellent. So it's about 60-40, as kind of what I've expected. This number, actually, the number of people that have heard of brown adipose tissue has gone up in recent years. Brown adipose tissue is a second class of adipose tissue that we all have, but we don't think about often. Now, brown adipose tissue looks very different from white adipose tissue. First and foremost, if you look at a section of brown adipose tissue, it doesn't look white, it looks brown. And it gets that brown color due to the fact that it has a lot of mitochondria. Mitochondria are the energy burning machinery of cells. Now, what's also different about brown adipose tissue is that you can see that it doesn't have these large lipid droplets. It has multiple small lipid droplets. Now, brown adipose tissue, because of its high mitochondrial content and its energy burning capacity, actually has the ability to take that stored energy and burn it to produce heat. Brown adipose tissue likely evolved as a way for mammals, particularly small mammals, such as rodents and other animals that live in the wild, to defend against the cold. And this is the tissue that becomes active, particularly in small mammals, when they are exposed to cold temperatures. But humans also have brown adipose tissue. And as infants, you can see in these imaging studies here, and what you're looking at is the area in green. We have brown adipose tissue as newborns and in infants in what we call the interscapular region, so just behind the shoulder blades. But as we get older, that particular brown adipose tissue kind of goes away. In adults, we also have brown adipose tissue. And we've only realized this in the last 10 years or so through revisiting PET scans. And what you can see here in the middle, if you focus on this purple box, within this purple box, you can see this area in black. That's your brown adipose tissue. And these are PET scans for glucose uptake. And those areas in black represent brown adipose tissue. So you can see it around the shoulder blades and in pockets around the neck. And we have this as adults, but to varying degrees. Not everybody has active brown adipose tissue. But what we've also noticed that in the condition of obesity, that brown adipose tissue is largely gone in most individuals. Again, it's variable. Some maintain it and some don't. What's interesting, though, is that whether or not you actually maintain that brown adipose tissue actually correlates with cardiovascular health, suggesting that brown adipose tissue can affect cardiovascular health. Now, there's tremendous interest, as you might expect, in stimulating the activity of these brown adipocytes. But there's also a lot of skepticism. And the skepticism lies in the fact of, the question of whether we actually have, as adults, enough of this brown adipose tissue to burn energy. And that's a concern. But one of the most amazing things about adipose tissue is its ability to adapt. And I think if there's one word that's synonymous with adipose tissue, it's the word adaptation. And one of the most remarkable things about adipose tissue, particularly white adipose tissue, is that it's also able to adapt to cold temperatures. So what I'm showing here is the white adipose tissue of a mouse following cold exposure. So mice were placed in the cold, and they're fine and they're happy in the cold because they have the ability to adapt. And following cold exposure, what you can see is that there's lots of these white fat cells, these large white fat cells, but there's also lots of the pockets of these brown-like fat cells. Now, these are fat cells that have properties of both white and brown fat cells. So we call these beige fat cells. What's remarkable is that these cells have the ability to burn energy and promote energy expenditure, but also they have the ability to increase insulin sensitivity and thus have an anti-diabetic effect. And what folks like me in the field are trying to understand then is that what drives the formation of these different types of fat cells, whether it be white fat cells or energy burning brown and beige fat cells. Now, there's a particular genetic program in these brown and beige energy burning cells that encodes this energy burning program. And what we've discovered in our lab is a protein called ZFP423. The name's unimportant. But what's important is that this is a protein that actually suppresses this energy burning program in fat cells, in white fat cells. So it's actually like a brake. You can think of it as a brake pedal on the energy burning program. And what we've shown in mice is that if you can remove this brake pedal from white adipocytes, you can basically reprogram these white adipocytes to become energy burning fat cells. And you can see that here in this tissue. Up top is a normal white fat tissue from a mouse. And when we remove this brake, this protein, just by removing this one protein from white fat, we were able to convert it into what looks like now this brown adipose tissue. And when we do that in these mice are actually resistant to gaining weight when they're fed a high caloric diet. But also, if you flip this switch, if you remove this brake pedal in mice that are already obese, we can trigger weight loss and we can improve their diabetes. We can improve their ability to handle glucose. So what this shows us really is that there are mechanisms that we can tap into to actually trigger or convert energy storing white fat into energy burning fat. And these are the kinds of things that we're thinking about as adipose tissue biologists now. But importantly, one of the things we have to understand first and foremost is, can we release this brake in human fat cells? And this is something that we're working on now. But before I turn it over to you guys, I want to leave you with this final message. We vilify fat cells often. We think of, we want to get rid of our fat cells. But it's important to remember that fat cells in some form are good. They're not necessarily bad, but they're often in bad shape. And that's sort of the problem that we have with fat cells. And that it's our adipose tissue quality and perhaps its location that's more important than its quantity per se in determining metabolic health. And one of the things that we think about constantly is whether or not we can actually fix the fat, so to speak, by improving its ability to store energy or increasing its capacity to burn energy as a way to improve the metabolic health. So with that, I think I've said enough, and I want to turn it over to you guys, and I want to hear what you guys have to say. But first, thank you for listening. I appreciate it.
Dr. Gupta, thank you. We appreciate your insight this evening. Now for audience questions. Our first comes from Emmy. Emmy, if you would like to unmute yourself, please.
Sure thing. Thanks. This was a great presentation. Thank you. It made me think of like 4 questions, but I'll start with the one that I started with. So where do all the adipocyte precursor cells reside before they get recruited? Like, does everyone have an adequate supply? Is that something that can be helped to help people when they're trying to, control everything?
Great question. This is something that we study intensely in our lab, the biology of the adipocyte precursors, or what we call the progenitors. It turns out that they live in your blood vessels. They live in the blood vessels of adipose tissue, right in the tissue. They hang around the blood vessels in close proximity, and they get activated when instructed. Now, what is the cue that activates them? That is something that we're trying to understand. And why are they activated in some people and not in others is something we're also trying to understand. But they are there. It's thought that they're there from a young age into an old age, but they do change their properties over time. And we're trying to understand how diet, age, and other factors impact the biology of those cells. So that's a great question.
Next, we have a question from Joyce Manalo. Joyce, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Hi, I'm so sorry. I was trying to figure out how to do it on the on my phone. Hi, Dr. Gupta. Thank you for having this talk. The question is there a test available where we can, like any normal person can find out about their fat cell type, quantity, and concentration right now?
That's a great question. There's really no, well, of course there's ways of assessing your body fat distribution and whether or not you're preferentially accumulating subcutaneous fat versus visceral fat. And that can be done, by talking to your doctor, but there's really no good indication of the quality of your adipose tissue and how it's behaving and functioning. There's some markers that can be measured. They're not typically measured clinically, but they can be. One is this hormone that I mentioned called adiponectin. That's a hormone that we often use in a laboratory setting to assess the quality and function of adipose tissue. But clinically, there's really not an accepted way of truly assessing the function and quality of your adipose tissue. But I think finding better biomarkers of that would be a great idea.
Okay, thank you.
Next, we have a pre-submitted question from Jack and Kirk. Is Jack on the line with us this evening? And if so, would you like to unmute and ask your question? I can ask the question for Jack.
Okay.
What does refined sugar do to the brain, specifically in kids who are still growing?
Oh, yeah. Great question, Jack. And that's a very relevant question considering everyone's probably eating candy after Halloween right now. And it's the problem with refined sugars is that there's a couple of problems. One is in terms of your brain, they activate parts of your brain that actually represent your reward system, particularly the dopaminergic system in your brain. And so you get that it activates this reward pathway, much like other addictive substances do. And that actually reinforces the cravings that you may have for sugar. Now, too much sugar in and of itself is problematic. These refined sugars, these simple sugars, they're easy to take in and digest. They don't cost, there's no cost to digest them, so they're pure calories. So in terms of what's happening to your brain is that you're actually really telling your brain, I want more, I want more. And it's a positive reinforcement of wanting more sugar, which is going to be problematic in the long term in terms of controlling your caloric intake. Now, also, there are studies to suggest that too much glucose over time can also affect your mood, and studies in rats suggest that it may sort of rewire parts of your brain in a way that could be detrimental in the long run. But it's also important to realize that what I tell my kids all the time is that too much sugar like that is not just affecting your brain; it's affecting all parts of your body. It's affecting your teeth and your other aspects of your health. So just remember that when you're eating too much sugar, you're activating that part of your brain that's going to create this sort of craving and cause this sort of pseudo addiction to even more sugar, which can be problematic down the line.
Thank you for answering that question. Our next question comes from Sapajit Paul. Would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Hello, hello, Dr. Gupta. This is a really nice presentation. I really liked it. I am particularly interested in the ZFP protein that you talked about. I'm assuming that when the mice were like the inactivation for ZFP was done on the mice, they were on normal diet. So what would happen if you just restricted the calories that were being provided to the mice and then you inactivated the ZFP? Have you guys tried any such thing?
That is a great question. We have not done that. I think what we've done is when we put them on a diet that we would consider a healthy diet, a calorie sort of a balanced calorie diet that does not cause weight gain or weight loss, that maintains energy balance, they are totally fine. They're healthy. What we tend to see is that they increase their energy expenditure. In other words, they're burning more calories when they're challenged to a diet that's high in calories. It's sort of what we call a high fat diet in mice. But what we haven't done is actually seen whether or not by flipping off this brake, can we actually maintain weight loss? I think that might be part of what you're asking. And that's actually a good idea. That's something that we haven't done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. Again, nice presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have a question from Donna Wood Martin. Donna, would you like to unmute and ask your question? Okay, I will ask Donna's question. Are there clinical trials we can enroll in for releasing that brake?
No, not yet. This is very preclinical work I'm describing here, and more proof of concept. This work is really at the early stages of trying to understand how to promote this sort of energy burning function in your fat cells. We have not identified a viable strategy to do this, to actually target this mechanism yet. But certainly that's underway. That's things that we're thinking about now. But this is a long way from reaching that finish line that we're all hoping for.
Thank you. Next, we have a question, from Rick. Rick, would you like to unmute?
Sure. Hi, I just was wondering if you could kind of talk about I've seen a lot recently about anti-obesity medications that were approved by the FDA, and I'm curious how they differ from sort of those old school diet pills, and will we be seeing kind of a renaissance in anti-obesity drugs, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. And, the key is to promote safe weight loss, right? And what I mean by safe is that you don't want to lose weight in an unhealthy way. You want to be able to, preserve function of your skeletal muscle and things like that. There's a lot of new drugs that are coming on that target multiple aspects of sort of physiology that I've talked about here. There's a new class of drugs that are emerging that are going to target food intake, try to increase your satiety, decrease food intake. Also target your gut to reduce the amount of calories that are going to be sort of taken in, but also target the production of insulin to promote sort of metabolic health. So I think you're seeing you're going to see over the next few years a new class of rationally designed drugs that are going to benefit metabolic health in a number of ways. And what these drugs really highlight is sort of the need to confront this problem on multiple levels. These new drugs are actually going to increase your metabolism and increase your satiety, right? So in other words, they're going to tackle this in multiple ways, not just by influencing energy intake, but energy expenditure. And that's kind of what's going to need to happen going forward. And most of these things that we've tried in the past don't really work on multiple levels.
Do you see it as, I was thinking about with mental health 20, 30 years ago, it wasn't really part of the culture for people to receive medication to help with anxiety and depression, but now it's very common. Do you see that maybe happening with anti-obesity medications if we can hit the right balance, as you talked about?
I think so. And I think what we need to realize is that there is going to be individuals where, diet and exercise, lifestyle intervention won't necessarily work. And just in also like in cases where behavioral therapy might not be sufficient, right? To continue your analogy. So I think there are going to be folks that just need a little help. And I think maybe these types of future medications will be helpful in that regard. I'm a big advocate of lifestyle interventions, but we all acknowledge that they're difficult, right, and challenging. So I think there's definitely room for medicinal approaches that are safe and healthy.
Thank you.
Thanks for your question.
Our next question comes from a high school teacher. She asks, how can I best support students to make better choices to improve their health?
Great question. I think my answer would be not specific to you or anybody else, but to everyone. I am not a physician. I don't treat patients. But when I talk to physicians that do treat patients, including my own wife, actually, what they tell us is that really that the best thing to do is to model the behaviors, model the choices and behaviors that we want to instill in others, in our children. So a lot of times, as a family, you have to work together, right, to improve your diet, to exercise. And I think, that our children will follow that lead of their role models. So I think modeling that behavior is what we all need to do. And I know it's hard, but I think that a family that takes this on together, or any kind of group that takes this on together, is more likely to succeed than individuals that go at it alone.
Thank you. This is another question that was pre-submitted. And the question is, can you address diabetes in South Asians and what specific genetic increases risk of metabolic diseases and lower BMIs?
That is a great question. Actually, it's near and dear to my heart. So let me show you something, actually, if you don't mind. And I actually have a slide on that. And it turns out that, yes, there is a large group of people that can develop type 2 diabetes that are not considered to be clinically obese, right? And so why is that? Well, part of that answer may also lie in adipose tissue. And particularly in studies have been done in the South Asian populations, because that's exactly what we see. We see individuals who are considered normal weight, but have type 2 diabetes. But some studies show something really interesting. If you look at the adipose tissue in these individuals, And shown here on the left is a section of adipose tissue from South Asians that are considered normal BMI, compared to a group of Caucasians that are also considered normal BMI. But look at the adipose tissue. Again, it looks unhealthy. You have these larger fat cells in the South Asians samples versus the Caucasian adipose tissue, or adipose tissue from Caucasians, which has smaller and more numerous fat cells. So this same principle may actually hold, where inadequate energy storage in adipose tissue may also underlie the development of diabetes independent of overall adiposity. In terms of the genetics underlying that, it's not clear, but there's a lot of, it's not clear what specifically might be happening in the South Asian population. However, overall genetic studies do suggest that that kind of adipose, what we call phenotype or characteristics, is linked to genetic variants associated with genes that are related to the formation of new fat cells. So there could be, so all that being said, long story short, it may also come down to the health of adipose tissue, even in individuals who are not obese.
Thank you. Our next question was also pre-submitted. Is the keto diet safe?
Good question. The keto diet is quite popular and can be quite effective. I would say it's largely safe unless it's not for you. And I think the answer to that really depends on what else is going on in your health. So my answer would be very simple: check with your doctor whether or not it's safe for you. But it can be quite effective, at least for a period of time.
Okay. The next question is taking fish oil supplements good for you?
Yeah, I would say same answer. It can be, unless it is, unless there's other things going on with your health that would indicate that you should not be taking it. So I would again say, talk to your doctor about whether it's right for you. And you should always talk to your doctor first about if any of these interventions are right for you, because it's complicated, right? But in general, yes, fish oil supplements can have some effect.
Okay. What could we do if our weight gain is due to medication side effects?
Yeah, that's very common. And it's also a good question. And not to sound like a broken record, but you'd want to, again, talk to your doctor about finding, medications, perhaps similar ones that are sort of weight neutral. And oftentimes you can, and sometimes you cannot. So again, you need to talk to your doctor, but that does happen.
Okay. Okay. One last question, Dr. Gupta. And you kind of touched on this a little earlier when you talked about family habits. The question is, will I get diabetes if most of my family has diabetes?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's no doubt there's a genetic component to this. It's a very complex genetic component to this, meaning that often there's more than one gene involved. Genetics plays a big role, but I would not say that it is, in most cases, inevitable that you will develop diabetes. There are, maintaining or healthy weight can help with that. But I would say with the right lifestyle interventions, in most cases you can kind of hold it off, at least for a long period of time. But again, it really depends on the nature of what we're talking about in terms of genetics. But that's where you want to talk to your doctor about preventive measures that you can take in terms of diet and exercise, talking to a nutrition, talking to those who are trained, to teach proper exercise to individuals, physical trainers and such. I think with that kind of lifestyle intervention, there's a good chance you can delay this, if not prevent it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Gupta. It was fascinating to learn about the different types of fat cells, and that despite what I thought prior, they're not all so bad. Thanks to Charlie and Jenny for helping run tonight's event. We hope all of you will join us in 2 weeks on Thursday, November 18th for our next Science Cafe episode, which is on the science of aging. And then our final program of the calendar year on December 2nd, which is going to focus on mental health issues, the pandemic specifically, and winter blues that can occur around the holidays. So Charlie's going to paste those registrations in the link. Before we adjourn, as always, we must implore you, your friends and family, to get a COVID vaccine and, if possible, a booster shot. Vaccines protect you from severe illness and death from COVID-19 and its many variants. For more COVID information, including vaccine appointments, click on the yellow COVID info bar at utswmed.org. Finally, even if you are fully vaccinated, please continue to wear masks, social distance, and be vigilant with hand hygiene, especially now that it's starting to get a little bit colder. Thank you for doing your part to contribute to our collective public health. And for now, we wish you good health, good spirits, and a good rest of your evening. We are adjourned. Thank you, everyone.